Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack the fascinating, rapidly evolving, and honestly under the radar dynamic between India and Taiwan. Today, we're looking at this relationship through what strategists call the DIME framework. That's diplomatic, informational, military, and economic options. So let's just dive right in with a pretty massive question. How exactly are military tensions high up in the Himalayas causing ripples all the way across the Indo-Pacific? And more importantly, how are those tensions pushing two dynamic democracies, India and Taiwan, closer together than they've been in decades? To make sense of this whole geopolitical web, we're going to break things down into 6 quick parts: the China catalyst, diplomatic maneuvers, informational exchange, military options, economic synergy, and finally, the strategic road ahead. Starting off with part 1, the China catalyst and the massive geopolitical shift underway. Historically, the India-Taiwan relationship has kind of always existed in the shadow of Beijing, but degrading Sino-Indian relations are totally upending that calculus. We've seen a really rapid escalation of parallel tensions over the last few years. Just think back to 2020 with the tragic Himalayan border clashes at Galwan Valley. Then jump to 2022. Following U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei, there was a staggering 766% increase in Chinese military flights around Taiwan in just a single month. For New Delhi, these aggressive parallel maneuvers have made it basically impossible to ignore the strategic value of Taiwan anymore. Moving on to part 2, diplomatic maneuvers and the Great Balancing Act. Now, diplomatically, India faces a really delicate situation. Traditionally, New Delhi has adhered to one China policy constraints, avoiding any formal diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. But back in 2019, New Delhi subtly broke its silence amid rising regional tensions. The Ministry of External Affairs issued this highly calculated, super-guarded critique, advocating for, unquote, avoidance of unilateral actions to change the status quo. But notice what's missing there. They deliberately avoided mentioning the One China principle altogether. It was a subtle yet absolutely massive signal to the international community. So instead of a loud, formal diplomatic rupture with China, analysts point out that India is employing a series of subtle yet incredibly significant shifts. We're talking about things like the renaming of Tibetan locations, issuing e-visas directly for Taiwanese citizens, and landmark parliamentary visits to Taipei, like Indian MP Sujit Kumar's visit. These maneuvers allow India to deepen its diplomatic footprint and signal its stance without outright crossing Beijing's red lines. All right, part 3, informational exchange, or what we might call shadow cooperation. This is where things get really interesting, because under-the-radar intelligence sharing is fast becoming a cornerstone of this relationship. The mutual benefit here is just undeniable. Taiwan holds unparalleled intelligence on Chinese naval movements, which they can pass along through channels like the US and the Quad. In return, India offers something incredibly valuable: a deep, historical working knowledge of Russian military hardware. And guess what? That is the exact kind of equipment Taiwan might face in a potential conflict with the PLA. But the informational exchange isn't just about military hardware. India is increasingly looking to Taiwan for Mandarin language expertise. On top of that, both democracies are facing severe, ongoing cyber threats. This was a huge wake-up call recently when India's premier medical institute, AIIMS, suffered a massive cyber attack on its IT system, with state actors heavily suspected. Suddenly, Taiwan's cutting-edge cybersecurity tech isn't just a nice-to-have. It's becoming absolutely vital for India's digital defense. Which brings us to part 4, military options and preparing for contingencies. Now, let's be realistic here. India is highly unlikely to directly fight a war over Taiwan, but they are absolutely actively preparing for the fallout of one. The Indian defense community is no longer ignoring the Taiwan Strait. Fact is, in July of 2023, India's Chief of Defense Staff officially ordered a study group to assess strategic options in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. They are literally mapping out contingency plans right now. Because formal military alliances are politically off the table, the two nations are exploring what experts call soft military cooperation. A perfect example of this is HADR, which stands for Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief. Both of these countries are highly vulnerable to typhoons, floods, and earthquakes, so working together on disaster relief is a non-provocative, highly practical way for their armed forces to build real-world interoperability. And that HDR foundation opens the door for all kinds of wide-ranging, non-traditional security collaborations. Out in the dynamic maritime space of the Indian Ocean region, India and Taiwan can partner up on search and rescue at sea, combating illegal fishing, combating illegal fishing, counter-piracy, maritime domain awareness, and even space cooperation. And we know the groundwork is already being laid for this. Take August 2023, for example. 3 former Indian military chiefs, a former Army chief, a Navy chief, and an Air Force marshal, all traveled to Taiwan to attend the Kitagalan Forum. Sure, they were officially labeled as private visits, but holding closed-door talks with Taiwan's premier defense think tank, that signifies a massive, calculated shift toward active security information sharing. Next up, Part 5, Economic Options, where tech meets trade. While the diplomatic and military domains are slowly developing, economics is undeniably the crown jewel of this strategic relationship right now. Bilateral trade between the two hit a massive $9 billion in the 2021 to 2022 fiscal year. To put that into perspective, trade was just a little over $1 billion back in 2001. That is explosive growth, driven by some seriously deep complementarities between their economies. And to understand why this matters to you directly, just think about the device you probably have in your pocket right now. A whopping 75% of the chips powering India's booming smartphone industry comes straight from Taiwan. Taiwan's absolute mastery of semiconductor manufacturing just perfectly meets the demands of India's massive, hungry consumer market. To mitigate global supply chain vulnerabilities, both of these nations are aggressively pursuing further economic integration. We're seeing free trade agreement negotiations, huge Taiwanese investments being funneled into the Make in India initiative, and the setup of joint semiconductor manufacturing hubs. They even established a landmark labor agreement in February 2025 to streamline moving skilled Indian talent directly into Taiwanese tech and manufacturing sectors. Finally, Part 6, the strategic road ahead in the Indo-Pacific. Pulling this all together, India is walking an incredibly precarious tightrope here. On one hand, India still relies on a massive $106 billion in trade with China. You literally can't just cut ties overnight. But at the exact same time, there is an absolute urgent necessity for a hedging strategy. India needs to build alternative supply chains, boost its technological self-reliance, and foster these quiet security ties with Taiwan to counterbalance regional aggression. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought. As the global center of gravity shifts eastward, and as the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic elements we've explored today continue to mature, could this unofficial, under-the-radar partnership ultimately reshape the entire security and economic architecture of Asia? It's definitely a space we all need to be watching closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope you walk away today with a much clearer picture of this vital geopolitical relationship.